My name is Dana Kellner, and I am 31 years old. I have worked as a pediatric nurse for 6 years, which means I spend most of my professional life helping people survive the worst moments of theirs. I know what the inside of a hospital looks like at 3 a.m. I know what fear smells like when it comes off a parent in a waiting room. I know how to stay calm when everything around me is not. What I did not know, not really, not until a Tuesday morning in February, was what it felt like to be the one who needed saving and to reach for the people who were supposed to show up and find nothing on the other end. I had just finished a 13-hour shift, not unusual for me. Pediatric units don't run on convenience, and I had covered for a colleague who had a family emergency of her own. By the time I walked out to the parking garage and got in my car, it was 5:34 a.m. The sky was that particular shade of dark that comes just before dawn, not quite black, more like the gray at the bottom of a coffee cup, and the temperature had dropped 14 degrees since I'd arrived the evening before. I noticed the frost on my windshield. I gave it a cursory scrape. I should have been more careful about the roads. I was 12 minutes from home when I hit the ice. I don't remember the moment of impact clearly. What I remember is the steering wheel pulling hard to the left even though my hands were doing the right things, and then the sound, not a crash, exactly, more like a long, grinding drop, and then the world was sideways. My car had gone off the shoulder of Route 9 heading west, down into a shallow ravine. The passenger side hit first. The airbag deployed. My head bounced off the driver's window, and I sat there for a full minute, maybe longer, not entirely sure where I was or what year it was. The pain came next. Pressure across my chest, deep and specific, which I recognized with the clinical part of my brain that apparently stayed on even when the rest of me had short-circuited. Broken ribs, probably. My right wrist had hit the door handle at some angle that made it hang in a direction it wasn't supposed to hang, and my left leg was pinned under the dashboard, where the collision had pushed the front panel inward. I was not going to be driving myself anywhere. I reached for my phone. It had flown from the cup holder and was face down on the passenger seat. When I picked it up, the screen had cracked diagonally across the top half, a thick spiderweb of fractures that made the upper portion completely unresponsive to touch. I pressed the screen in different places, trying to get the keypad up to dial. Nothing in the top 2/3 of the screen registered. The bottom third still worked. My contacts list, which lived low on the screen, was still accessible. I want to be honest about this because I know it's the first thing anyone will ask. Why didn't I call 911? I'm a nurse. I know better. The answer is that my phone's keypad, when it came up, sat entirely in the dead zone. The numbers didn't respond. I tried 4 times. I was also concussed, though I didn't have full clarity on that yet, and the only thing my brain could produce in that moment was a name. My brother Scott. He lives 8 minutes from that stretch of road. He's been the person I called first my entire life. I called him. It went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called my mother. Voicemail. I went back to Scott. I'm not entirely sure how many times I cycled between them. I know that at some point the call log would show 9 attempts to my brother and 4 to my mother, and I know the last one I made to my mother's number was at 6:02 a.m., 28 minutes after my car left the road. By that point, I was getting lightheaded in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. What I didn't know was that my brother was asleep in his apartment with his phone on silent. He had been out Monday night celebrating a promotion with his friends. Something he'd mentioned to me last week, and which I had of course been happy about. He later told me that he'd turned his ringer off because he didn't want to deal with calls until morning. I figured if it was something urgent, whoever it was would leave a message, he said. As though urgent means nothing until it's convenient. My mother's phone was on the kitchen charger. She told me later that she'd seen the missed calls when she woke up around 8, but had figured that since she hadn't heard from the hospital, I must have been fine. When I pointed out that she couldn't have heard from the hospital if she hadn't answered for them to call back, she said she guessed that was true and looked at the wall. What saved me, in the immediate sense, was not my family. It was a man named Roy Tremblay who drove a refrigerated freight truck on a regular route through that part of the county, and who, at approximately 6:09 a.m., spotted a set of tire marks in the frost on the shoulder that didn't look right. He pulled his rig onto the gravel, climbed down from the cab, and walked to the edge of the ravine with a flashlight. He told me later that he almost talked himself out of stopping, that he thought it was probably an old skid mark from days ago, that he had a delivery window to hit in 40 minutes and couldn't afford a delay. He stopped anyway. He said he didn't know exactly why, only that something about the way the tracks cut off at the guardrail didn't sit right with him. And in 11 years of driving that route, he had learned to pay attention to the things that didn't sit right. He called 911 before he even climbed down the embankment. That was the correct order of operations, and the one I should have started with. I know that. The dispatcher stayed on with him while he made his way down to my car. He knocked on my window, and I turned to look at him, and I remember thinking he had an ordinary face. Not young, not old, somewhere in his late 50s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas work jacket with a fleece collar, the kind that costs $40 at Tractor Supply and lasts a decade. He looked like somebody's dad, and not in a vague way, in the specific way of a man who had been somewhere consistent and reliable for a long time. He talked to me through the window until the fire department arrived. He asked me my name. He asked what day it was. He asked what I did for work, and when I told him I was a pediatric nurse, he said, "Good. Then you can help me keep you awake." I think I laughed. It surprised both of us. He stayed on that embankment in below freezing temperatures for 22 minutes until I was out of the car and in the hands of the paramedics. When they took over, Roy had to step back. The last thing I remember before I was fully loaded into the ambulance was his voice saying, "She's got people with her now. She's going to be okay." I don't know if he was talking to me or to himself. Either way, I held on to it. I woke up in a hospital room, a different hospital than mine, with different equipment layouts and a different smell, and the first thing I registered, before the pain, before the tubes, was that the room was quiet. No one was sitting with me. A nurse came in and saw I was awake and said, "There you are." 2 words, but she said them like she meant them. She told me I had 3 fractured ribs, a broken wrist that had been set and splinted during the night, and a moderate concussion. She told me I had been unconscious for about 4 hours. I asked her if anyone had come. She paused in that way. People pause when they're choosing their words carefully. She said my emergency contacts had been reached and my family had been notified. Then she mentioned, almost as an aside, that there was a man in the waiting room who had been there since 6:30 that morning. He had asked twice for updates on my condition, and both times the front desk had told him that per privacy policy, they could only share information with family. He had nodded each time and gone back to his chair. I knew immediately who it was. Dr. Hennessy came in about 20 minutes later. He was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the kind of composure that comes from years of delivering difficult information to people who weren't ready to hear it. He pulled a chair up close to my bed before he said anything, which told me this was not a quick check-in. He walked me through my injuries: ribs, wrist, concussion, 6 to 8 weeks of careful recovery, no strenuous activity, follow-up scheduled. Then he said something else. He said, "The man who called your accident in, Roy Tremblay, he spoke with our triage staff when you came in. Gave your name, your approximate age, what he observed at the scene. He's been in the waiting area since 6:30 this morning." He glanced toward the window. "It's almost noon. 5.5 hours. Roy Tremblay had sat in a waiting room in a hospital he had no connection to for 5.5 hours, waiting to hear if the woman he'd found in a ditch was alive. I asked if Roy could come in. He was at the door 2 minutes later, the same canvas jacket. He had a paper coffee cup in one hand and held it awkwardly when he saw me awake, like he didn't know what to do with it now. He stepped inside slowly, the way you enter a room when you're not certain you belong there. I told him he belonged there. He sat in the chair Dr. Hennessy had just left, set the coffee on the floor beside him, and folded his hands in his lap. He introduced himself properly. Roy Tremblay, out of Utica, driven freight routes through this county for 11 years. He said he was sorry he hadn't spotted the tire marks sooner. I want to stay with that for a moment. He had spotted the tire marks, pulled over his truck, climbed down a frozen embankment, called 911, and stood in the cold for 22 minutes. And his first instinct was to apologize for not being faster. I started crying. Not the composed kind. The kind that comes from somewhere you've been pressing down for a long time. The kind that has nothing to do with the immediate moment and everything to do with it at the same time. Roy didn't try to wrap it up or redirect me or say everything would be fine. He just sat there, his hands still folded, and let me get through it. When I could speak again, I told him about the cracked screen, about the 9 calls to Scott, about the 4 to my mother. He listened without making me feel foolish for any of it. Then he told me something he'd done that I hadn't known about. When the paramedics had taken over and Roy had climbed back up to the road, he'd realized he'd missed his delivery window. He called his dispatcher to report it. While doing that, he noticed that my cracked phone had been left on the hood of the ambulance by a paramedic who'd set it down to free up his hands. Roy flagged it, made sure it got handed to the hospital staff with my belongings, but before he let it go, he'd asked the paramedic if it was okay to scroll my contacts and notify anyone else who should know I was coming in. The paramedic said, "Go ahead." Roy found the contact labeled "Work, PEDS unit" in my phone. He called it, identified himself as a bystander at the scene, and told whoever answered that Dana Kellner had been in an accident and would not be in for her next shift. He didn't know if it mattered. He figured someone at my job should know. My charge nurse later told me Roy's call came in at 6:23 a.m. My brother called my workplace at 2:14 p.m. Nearly 8 hours later, after someone from my unit had already been trying to reach my family for an update. My family arrived at the hospital at 1:45 in the afternoon. My brother Scott walked in first. He's 34, 2 years older than me, and he walked in the way he always does, filling up whatever space he enters, already talking before he's all the way through the door. He said, "Oh my God, Dana, what happened? Are you okay?" He hugged me in a way that jostled my ribs and I made a sound and he said, "Oh, sorry," and let go. My mother came in behind him. She kissed my forehead and smoothed the blanket at the foot of my bed. A gesture I have watched her perform my entire life, this smoothing of things, as if the blanket were the problem that needed tending. I asked them why they hadn't answered. Scott said he'd had his phone on silent. He said he and some guys had been out celebrating his promotion Monday night, and he hadn't wanted to deal with calls until morning. I figured if it was something real, whoever it was would leave a message, he said. I don't always check voicemail right when I wake up. He said it the way you'd explain why you missed a dentist appointment. Mildly inconvenient, easily understood. My mother said her phone had been in the kitchen on the charger and she had been asleep. She said she'd seen the missed calls at 8. By then, Scott had already texted the family group chat that I was stable, so she'd waited until he could drive her over. I was pinned in a car in a frozen ravine for 28 minutes, making 13 calls between two people who were 8 minutes and 40 minutes away respectively, and they found out I was stable before they found out I was injured, and they came after lunch. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Scott looked around the room and spotted the vase of yellow daisies on the windowsill. He picked it up and read the small card. "Who's RT?" Roy had left them before I woke up. He'd gone down to the hospital gift shop sometime in those 5.5 hours. I told my brother a man I'd never met before had left them. Scott set the vase back down and said, "That's a little weird." They stayed for just over an hour. Scott asked whether my car was totaled, whether I had called my insurance, and whether I had thought about how the tow was going to work, because a vehicle couldn't stay in a ravine indefinitely. I told him I had been in a hospital bed for most of the past 7 hours. He said he knew that he was just thinking practically. My mother asked whether I would be recovered enough by next Saturday for Scott's promotion dinner. She said it was at a restaurant downtown, and they'd already made the reservation, and she was wondering if she should call ahead to request a chair with extra back support in case my ribs were giving me trouble. I looked at her. She looked back at me. She said, "I'm just trying to plan ahead." They said goodbye around 3 o'clock. My mother said she'd call me tomorrow. Scott said to keep him updated on the car situation. Then they were gone, and I lay in that quiet room for a long time, looking at the yellow daisies, thinking about the 9 calls and the 4 calls, and the one man who had heard nothing, known nothing, and still spent 5.5 hours sitting in a plastic chair, waiting to know I was alive. Roy came back the next morning. He brought his wife this time. Her name is Dolores, and she is a small woman with silver hair and the kind of warmth that seems structural, like it's built into her frame rather than switched on for company. She walked in carrying a canvas tote bag and immediately assessed the room the way someone assesses a situation they intend to fix. She had brought food. 4 containers properly labeled and stacked, chicken soup, a corn muffin wrapped in foil, applesauce, and a thick slice of pound cake. She set them on the tray table next to my bed and said, without preamble, "I don't care what anyone tells you, people don't heal on hospital food. They survive it. That's a different thing entirely." I laughed. A real laugh, the first one since before the ice. Roy and Dolores stayed 2 hours. Not because anything urgent needed to be said, but because they sat down and stayed, which is its own category of thing. We talked about Roy's routes, about my job, about the particular misery of hospital coffee at 7 in the morning, about what this part of the county looks like in May when everything comes back. At some point, Dolores took my unbandaged hand in both of hers and didn't say anything for a little while. She didn't need to. It was the most settled I had felt since I woke up in that room. Before they left, Roy mentioned almost in passing that he'd given a written statement to the county sheriff's department at the scene. Standard practice for him, he said, something he did whenever he called in an accident. He'd also filed a report with his company's safety department, also routine. Both documents included timestamps. The timestamp on his original 911 call, the time the ambulance left the scene, the 22 minutes he spent on that embankment. He hadn't created those records to protect me. He'd created them because it was the correct way to document what he'd witnessed. But the record existed. The timeline existed. And in that timeline, the first call to emergency services came from a freight driver on his way to a delivery window who had no reason to stop. The calls from my family's phones did not appear in it at all. 3 days later, I learned through the hospital's patient services office that Roy had also quietly flagged my account to the billing team, given them his contact information, and asked to be notified if there were any complications with my insurance coverage. I had a high deductible plan, and the after-hours emergency and surgical fees were significant. Roy had said, and I am quoting what the patient services coordinator told me, "I don't know her situation, but just in case." He had not mentioned any of this during either of his visits. I called him. He sounded embarrassed when I brought it up, the kind of embarrassed that lands on someone when they're caught doing something genuinely decent. He asked if I was upset. I told him I was not upset. I told him I didn't have the right word for what I actually felt, and that I was a person who generally had words for things. He said, "You don't need a word for it. Just get better." I was discharged on Thursday, 6 days after the accident. Scott offered to pick me up but said he couldn't come until after 3 because of a work thing. I took a rideshare home. He sent a text that evening that said, "Glad you're home," followed by a thumbs up. I looked at it for a while. Then I set my phone down without responding. I have not spoken to him since. My mother I am still in contact with, if I'm being honest. Less than before. More carefully. I am learning the difference between a door I've closed and a door I've simply stopped standing in front of. They feel similar from the outside but very different from the inside. With Scott, the door is closed. He called once after I went quiet, left a voicemail saying he felt like I was making the accident into a whole thing. I didn't call back. I still have the voicemail. I'm not sure why, except that sometimes you need evidence of the thing you finally stopped explaining. Roy texted last week to check on how the wrist was healing. Dolores called the week before to say she'd made another batch of the pound cake and could drop some off when Roy's route brought him through. I said yes. She came on a Thursday afternoon, and we had coffee at my kitchen table for almost 2 hours. She told me about her own mother, who died 2 years ago, and about the year after that when she wasn't sure how to be a person without her. She said grief has a way of reorganizing everything, that you find out what was load-bearing and what was just filling space. Before she left, she said something I have been carrying with me every day since. She said, "You know what I figured out after my mom was gone? The people who love you right, they don't need you to earn it first. You just deserve it." That's the whole sentence. I think about that when my ribs catch wrong on a deep breath. I think about it when my wrist aches in the way the doctor says will fade but hasn't yet. I think about it when I replace the yellow daisies on my windowsill, which I have done 3 times now, because I decided that window was not going to stay empty. If you are someone who has ever reached out in a moment of real need and been met with silence, not absence, but silence, the kind that means someone saw and chose not to answer, I want you to hear this. That silence is information. It is not a verdict on what you're worth. It is a map showing you exactly where to stop pouring yourself. And sometimes, in the most unexpected places, on the shoulder of a frozen road in the dark at 6 in the morning, you find the shape of what you were always owed. Roy Tremblay stopped his truck. That is the complete sentence. He stopped, and everything that followed came from that single decision. A man with a delivery window and $40 boots and no obligation to anyone in that ravine stopped his truck, climbed down an embankment in the cold, and stayed. The people who stop for you, even when stopping costs them something. Even when you are a stranger, they have no reason to notice. Those are the people who teach you what the word family was always supposed to mean. And once you know the difference, you cannot unknow it. You don't go back to settling for people who left you on red while you were lying on a frozen road. You just don't.